gonna turn the lights down. You guys aren't gonna be scared, are you?
Yeah.
Ghost stories are so much better in the dark. Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Especially this time of year, as we're now officially into fall, and Halloween is just around the corner. My name is Dianna Stampfler. I own a company called Promote Michigan, and I've been researching lighthouses in the state of Michigan since the late 1990s. And at first I just cataloged them by name and height and whatnot, but I quickly got lured in to these ghost stories. And so I was actually at a different version of this presentation called Michigan's Ghostly Lights. And in 2016, I think it was, the History Press Googled the topic and my name came up. And they emailed and said, would you be interested in writing a book for us? Because lighthouse books sell really well and ghostly books sell really well. And if we put them together, it'll sell really, really well. So I thought about it for a little bit and then I put my mind to it and got the book written. It was released in March of 2019. The first 1,000 copies sold out in 3 weeks. So I was pretty excited about that. It made it as high as number 2 on Amazon.com in their haunted category in that first month as well. So it's been a pretty exciting ride. And it was really great. A lot of people ask me, what's it like writing a book and working for a publisher like the History Press, which is a division of Arcadia Publishing. And they were great because they basically said, you pick the lights, you pick the stories, you pick the photos, just send us whatever you want. Here's your word count, here's how many images we need. So I got to pick the stories that I thought were the most exciting and had the best photos, and tonight I'm going to walk you through the 13 chapters of the book, because in all honesty, if you're going to write about haunted things, 13 is the number you need to focus on, right?
Yeah.
So if you did not know, Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state. We have almost 130 lights in Michigan, both on mainland and out in the Great Lakes themselves. We also have more miles of freshwater coastline. So it also makes sense that we have a lot of haunted lights. There are about 40 to 50 of our lights that have haunted stories attached to them, and actually there are 13 chapters in the book, but you're going to get 14 different lights featured tonight. There's a bonus in there. So this is the geographical map that we're going to go through. We're going to start down in southwest Michigan and make our way up to the Upper Peninsula, to Lake Superior, and then down the coast of Lake Huron. And then we'll open it up for Q&A here at the end. I want to introduce you to Captain James S. Donahue. He was a New York man. He was a soldier in the Civil War, actually injured in battle, and he was hit with a bullet in the knee and had to have his leg amputated. And after he recovered, he made his way to mid-Michigan, got married, and found a job as a lighthouse keeper in South Haven. And he worked there for 35 years. He walked on a peg leg or crutches. And it was quite interesting to think about the life and the dedication that he had. Now, how many of you have actually climbed a lighthouse? Right? Can you imagine doing that on a peg leg? Right? Not only did he have to climb the tower, but he lived where the circle is on the right-hand side of the photo. That's where the keeper's residence was in South Haven. So he actually had to walk down a set of stairs that were built into the back of the property, walk along the river, out to the lighthouse, and then climb the tower on that peg leg or his crutches for 35 years, day in and day out. There's a reason he still wants the place, right? Because you got to put some serious commitment into your job in order to do that. We also heard stories that when the weather was bad, he sometimes would crawl on his hands and knees to the lighthouse, and he would hold his lantern in his teeth just to get there. He spent countless nights sleeping in the tower so that he could keep that light going, particularly during storms when ships might be in distress and really need to see that light. That's the level of dedication that he had to his service. Because of his disability, he did enlist the help of his wife. It was his second wife. He lost his first wife shortly after their first child was born, and his children. And it was a family business, and they all helped out. He also had several other jobs in town and was a well-known and award-winning lighthouse keeper. And he was so dedicated to that profession, which is why I think he still resides inside the keeper's residence in this community. This is the keeper's residence. It is now owned by the Michigan Maritime Museum, and it is a library and research facility. So if you ever need to do research on lighthouses, ships, shipwrecks, maritime-related things, this is a great resource. You just need to make an appointment to go through that. Over the years, the volunteers here have said that they have heard voices and footsteps coming from within the house when no one else is there. And they attribute those back to Captain Donahue. The White River Light Station in Whitehall was constructed in 1875, and it was built because of the dedication of Bill Robinson. He came to the Whitehall area in the 1860s with his wife Sarah and 7 of their eventually 13 children. Can you imagine trying to sleep 13 kids in that lighthouse? It was, I don't know where they stacked them all, but he got there was no lighthouse actually there when they moved to town, and he was distraught by that, and he actually petitioned the U.S. Lighthouse Service to have the light built, and he did that for over 5 or 6 years, working diligently, keeping track of all the ships coming in, and at the same time, every night he would walk to the end of the channel and hang a lantern from a shepherd's hook, so that the ships that came in after dark would at least have some light to guide them to safety. So when the light was completed and put into service in 1876, he was named the first keeper. And he served there for 45 years. It's the only light he ever worked at. Several of his sons and grandsons went on to lighthouse service in Lake Michigan as well. And obviously with that many kids, they did lose 3 children in childhood. So 10 kids made it to be adults. So that's a big family, and many of the descendants are still around. In fact, I spoke over in Bay City in 2019, and a descendant of the family was in the audience that night. So he passed away in 1919, and he was actually supposed to leave the house, the lighthouse, on April 3rd of that year, and he died the night before. So he never intended to leave White River Light Station. And in fact, over 100 years later, he still has not left White River Light Station. Karen McDonald, who served as the museum curator there from the 1980s until about 5 years ago, said that after she moved in, she and her young son moved in and lived in the back duplex of the lighthouse. Shortly after that, she started hearing footsteps at night, and she said she could hear the thump of Bill's cane. Because you can see here the picture where he walked with a cane in later years. And she said she could hear him shuffling around upstairs, going up the tower, his feet and the sound of that cane. And she told me that she was not frightened by it. In fact, it was comforting to her because she felt if he was there keeping an eye on the light, he would keep an eye on them. And he wouldn't let anything happen to them inside his light. So she welcomed his presence that was there. Shortly after that, she encountered another spirit, that of Sarah Robinson. Sarah died in 1891. She was in her 50s and she had a stroke. And so Bill was pretty distraught over that. And later on, when they found this photograph of Sarah, they hung it in one of the exhibit rooms upstairs. And Karen said strange things started to happen. She had gone upstairs one day to dust that glass display case, and the phone rang. Now this is back before we had cell phones, so she actually had to go downstairs and answer a landline. Now it might have even been attached to the wall, I don't know. So she gets done with the call, she goes back upstairs, and she notices that all the dust has gone off the top of the display, and the dusting supplies have moved from one side to the other. A little weird. Do you want a ghost that's gonna clean your house?
Yeah.
Because I'll take a couple of them. I have a big house. She knew Sarah had a reputation as a meticulous housekeeper. It was her job to keep the lighthouse in tip-top shape, and so she quietly thanked Sarah for her help and has welcomed Sarah's ghost there as well. I think it's kind of romantic that Bill and Sarah are back together in their lighthouse again, right? So this is their headstones at the Mouth Cemetery in Montague. They are buried in a small family plot in this abandoned and also haunted cemetery next to a cult property. So if you're ever going to go to Montague and you're into all that, you might want to go and seek out the Mouth Cemetery. Just don't sit in the white plastic chair. You've been warned. I went the year after that first photo was taken, and someone had actually pushed her headstone over, which was quite devastating. I know that the family has been working to clean up their plot and to reassemble her headstone. I believe, I haven't been back out there since this last summer, but I believe that it has been fixed at this point. Has anybody ever been to South Manitou Island? A couple of us, okay. So South Manitou was a very significant island port in northern Lake Michigan. This harbor here, this crescent-shaped harbor, is the deepest natural harbor in that part of the lake, which meant that they saw a lot of traffic with early schooners and steamships that came into that harbor during rough weather because they could seek refuge there, or they could come in and get cordwood or other supplies. There are also stories that there were certain instances where ships traveling from Detroit to Chicago were coming through, and there were several cholera outbreaks in the 1800s. And they often would have passengers who had died of this, and they did not want to take, it was incredibly contagious, they did not want to take these infected bodies into Chicago Harbor, so they would bury them in shallow graves on the island, close to the shore. Which meant, you know, when the sands moved and the waves came up, it, you know, moved the bodies around. There are also stories that there were occasionally people who may not necessarily have been dead yet, but were likely to die before they got to Chicago, and they were buried as well, buried alive.
Oh dear.
So the island itself has a creepy factor to it. There were over 200 residents living here on the island in the 1860s, among them Aaron and Julia Sheridan. Aaron was also a Civil War soldier, much like Donahue. You can see here his left hand hangs by his side. He actually had all of the bones in the lower half of his hand were shattered. And so while it was probably a little easier for him to tend a light with one arm versus one leg, think about this. The lighthouse tower is 117 steps. And he's carrying up that tower a pail of hot oil that weighs about 80 pounds. He's got to carry it in his right hand because he can't use his left hand. But that means he has to go up those stairs and not hold on to the railing. I can't go up a lighthouse without clinging to the railing like it's a death grip. So can you imagine him taking that trip up and down every day and not being able to hold on for safety? Now, given the height of the tower, given the importance of this island port and his injury, he's actually able to get Julia as an assistant keeper as officially with the U.S. Lighthouse Service. So she was receiving a salary, as was he. He made about $300 and $350 a year. She made about $150. Not a big paying job, but they got a house provided to them and all the things that they needed to keep that house going. So there were some perks. So Aaron and Julia, they are out here on the island. They are tending to the light. In addition to that, she's also raising 6 sons. And life is good for them until March of 1878. At that point, Aaron and Julia hired this other gentleman, his name is Christian Ankerson, and he sailed them across to the mainland in a boat similar to this. This is called a Mackinac, and it's about a 25-foot open-air sailboat, and most of the lighthouses in the Great Lakes had them, and they would go back and forth between the island and the mainland as necessary. Well, on the return trip, the boat capsized, March 15th. Can you imagine being in an open-air sailboat in northern Lake Michigan in March? What the water would have been like, what the temperatures? But this storm capsized the boat, and Aaron with his one arm was unable to save himself, his wife, and they had with them their youngest child, Robert. He was 9 months old, and he also drowned. All three drowned that day. Christian survived. He clung to the overturned boat, was rescued later, and was put in through an inquisition to see if it was his fault at all that the boat went down, but they determined it was weather-related, so he was not held accountable. The remaining Sheridan children, the 5 older brothers, which ranged from about 4 or 5 until 16, they walked the shore waiting for the bodies to come, and they never did. They were never recovered. And it was quite a tragedy for the family. The boys were sent to live with relatives in Chicago. And it wasn't until 2008 that historical markers were actually placed out on the island, which of course is now part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, in order to remember those who lost their lives that day. Now, over the years, people have said that as they climbed the tower at South Manitou, at the area where the tower connects to the house, there's a connected causeway there, that they can often hear cries coming from the house. And I'm not exactly sure if that is Julia's cries or if they're the cries of their children over the loss, but we do believe that they are attributed back to the Sheridan family. Now, I did my first paranormal investigation at a lighthouse at South Manitou in the summer of 2003. I was a guest at the National Park Service. They do day trips, and they let me stay in the Coast Guard station for a couple nights. And when the boat went back for the afternoon, they tossed me the keys to the lighthouse and said, have at it, lock it up when you're done. So I went out, it was a full moon night, so I thought, if anything, I'm gonna see some ghosts tonight, right? So we go out, there's 2 of us, we go and we sit on the various landings in the tower waiting to hear something, particularly at that causeway connection area. We sit and wait, nothing. We get to the top of the tower just in time to see sunset, the moon is coming out, the full moon is coming out. Even after 2 bottles of wine, we didn't see any ghosts. But it made that trip down the tower a little challenging. I don't like towers to begin with. Now this is George Sheridan. He was the second oldest son of Aaron and Julia. And he was in the tower on the island at the lighthouse when the boat went down. He and his older brother actually saw the ship sink. And even though there's a Coast Guard station right there between the lighthouse and the harbor, the storm was bad. They were just far enough away where no one could get out to them in time. So it was pretty tragic. But I think this is what led him to become a lighthouse keeper himself. He really wanted to keep his family legacy alive. And so he served at several lights in southern Lake Michigan, and he was there for 14 years at the Kalamazoo River Light in Saugatuck, which most people don't even know Saugatuck used to have a lighthouse. It was decommissioned in 1914, and George was the only officially trained keeper at this light, and he was the last one to serve there at the time of its decommissioning. It was destroyed by a tornado in the 50s. George actually struggled with depression most of his life after what happened to his family. And so when this light was decommissioned, before he took service to another light, he checked himself into an asylum in Kalamazoo for treatment for depression. And as a result, his wife, Sarah, actually signed the closing papers to decommission this light. And in the interim, he was, waiting to take over in a new light, but because he was institutionalized and there was a gap in his service, he lost the job. And back then, there was no disability or pension or unemployment or any kind of benefits for the keepers or for their families if they died. So when his mom and dad died, those kids got nothing. There was no money set aside to take care of those children. So 1914, they decommissioned the light in Saugatuck. He loses his job because he's in the institution. Then he learns that his wife, Sarah, isn't going to go with him to his next assignment. She and their 3 children are going to stay behind in Saugatuck. So here you have a mentally unstable man who just lost his job, has no money, has no home, just lost his wife and children. And so he heads down to Evanston, Illinois, to Grosse Pointe Lighthouse, where his cousin or his uncle is the keeper, and while he's there, he hung himself in the boathouse. And it is said that his spirit is at this particular property as well. So it was just a real tragedy that continued on for the Sheridan family. This is one of the more interesting stories, and one of the ones that I've been telling the longest. This is Waukesha's Shoal Lighthouse. It's located near Mackinac City, near Wilderness State Park and the Headlands Dark Sky Park. And in the late 90s, this was probably one of the first ghost stories I ever heard. And I heard that this light was haunted by the ghost of a former keeper by the name of John Herman. I wish I had a photograph of this guy. John Herman came in as an assistant keeper in 1887, and he worked his way up to head keeper, and in 1900, he was the guy in charge. And as the story goes, John Herman loved 2 things. He loved a good practical joke, and he loved a good stiff drink. And on October 14th of 1900, those 2 things didn't mix so well for him. Apparently, he'd been in town to a tavern, came back drunk, locked his assistant in the tower. Thought it was funny. And the assistant keeper did not. And after many hours, that assistant keeper is still locked up in the tower. He finally sends a distress call to a nearby light. That keeper comes over, lets him out, and of course he wants to wring John Herman's neck. But they can't find him. He's never seen again. In his drunken stupor, they believe he fell over the edge and drowned, and his body just washed away. But over the next 10 years, the shenanigans continued, even though he wasn't there. Silverware would rattle in the drawers, steel doors would come open. If you lean back in your chair on the back 2 legs, you better be prepared to be laying on the ground, because he'd knock that chair out from underneath you. And all these things they attributed to John Herman, and it became so haunted that no man would accept a job there. And the local legend is that's why they decommissioned the lighthouse in 1910, when in fact they had built a different light in this area and made this one obsolete. So as I'm doing the research, my dad, who is a genealogist, was doing some digging around for me, and he said, hey, I found something interesting about that drunk lighthouse keeper. I said, all right, what'd you find out about John Herman? He said, he didn't fall off the lighthouse and drown. He died on Mackinac Island of a heart attack. Dr. Bogan here had been treating him from October 11th to October 14th, and he died at 1:30 in the afternoon on Mackinac Island. So follow this theory with me. If on the evening of October 14th, which is when he supposedly locked that assistant in the tower, what if the reason they never found him was because it was the ghost who locked him up there? Right? I mean, if you're going to believe in ghost stories, you got to believe in all kinds of possibilities, right? Seems as good a theory as anything else. I did find his interment record. I found a death announcement in the newspaper. He is buried at St. Anne's Catholic Cemetery somewhere. We don't know exactly where he's at, but I keep looking every time in case this headstone pops back up or something. This is what the light looks like today. It was used during World War II for bombing practice. It's number 1 on the doomsday list. In fact, it's likely to topple over into Lake Michigan in the coming years. Shishwa Point Lighthouse in Gulliver in the Upper Peninsula. And this is probably one of the most haunted lights. About as many as 5 ghosts are believed to be here. Several stories, hundreds of stories actually, coming out of this light. Most of them attributed to this gentleman. His name is Captain Joseph Willie Townsend, and he came into this lighthouse in 1900, and he served until his death in 1910. He died of what they believe was lung cancer. One of the most interesting things I found in the research was that he, prior to coming to Shishwa, was an assistant keeper at Waukesha's under John Herman. There's a 50-50 chance he was the guy locked in the tower that night. Isn't that funny, the connection? And he goes on to haunt another lighthouse. Townsend is actually, he dies in April. He's embalmed in the basement of the lighthouse. They asked me if I wanted to go through the basement last time I was there, and I declined. But he's embalmed in the basement. He lays in state in the parlor for 3 weeks because his family's from New York, and it's 1910, so they have to travel by train. And a train from New York through the Great Lakes up to St. Ignace, across the car ferry up, and then down to Gulliver. Well, after that, it's still April in the UP. How easy is it to dig a grave in the UP in April? So they put him back in the basement until they could bury him in nearby Manistee. And over the years, it's interesting, people have walked through the lighthouse and they will get the distinct odor of cigar smoke. I haven't had it personally, but I have several friends who've experienced it. Sometimes they see his face in a mirror in the upstairs bedroom. He likes to mess around with the silverware in the kitchen. He does a lot of weird things in the kitchen. He opens cupboard doors, moves the silverware around, moves the chair out, and it's always at the same place setting, which was his seat. So the curator of the museum up there, they've been keeping track of these stories for years. I went to visit his gravesite and I left him a cigar. I should have gone back a few hours later to see if he smoked it. I may or may not have stood on his grave and smoked a cigar once and took a shot of whiskey. So this is the bonus light for the program. This is Sandpoint Lighthouse in Escanaba. And I was going to put it in the book originally, but when I talked to the Delta County Historical Society, they were adamant that the lighthouse was not haunted, even though I had heard for years that it was. Well, the day in 2018 when I was at Shishwa, I ran into a family and I was telling them about my book, and one of the girls, I think she was about 10, she said, well, is Sands Point going to be in your book? And I said, no, they're telling me it's not haunted. And she said, yes, it is. I said, really, what happened? She said, we were there today, and I was upstairs with my sister, and I heard a woman scream, help me. Well, the interesting story about this is that in 1886, Mary Terry was the keeper of the light, and there was a mysterious fire, and she died in that fire. But there's been speculation over the past century or more that she was actually murdered and that the fire was started to make it look like she died accidentally. And I'll dig into that story in my new book coming out in March called Death and Lighthouses of the Great Lakes, The History of Mayhem and Murder. Dun, dun, dun. I'll show you the mock cover in a little bit. So now we're up to Lake Superior. Has anybody ever stayed at the Big Bay Point Lighthouse? Did you read the ghost stories before bed? Don't do that. It's not, I didn't sleep the whole time I was there. Big Bay Point Lighthouse, just northwest of Marquette. A beautiful bed and breakfast has been operating as a B&B since the 1980s. But back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, William Pryor was the head keeper. He was a redheaded man. He was kind of cranky and never had anything good to say about his assistant keepers until he got his son Edward appointed as his keeper. And his son worked with him for about a year until he fell, cut his leg, was hospitalized, and the cut was actually infected, got gangrene, and he died. And it was a tragedy, and the last time the William Pryor wrote in his logbook was, "Buried my son today." And the next day, the last time anybody saw him, he was headed off to the woods. A year later, they found his remains hanging in a tree by a local hunter. And since that time, people have reported seeing a man dressed in a early 1900s lighthouse keeper uniform walking the grounds. He has been known to be inside. He likes to rattle the cupboards in the kitchen late at night or into the early morning hours, to which former keepers of the B&B have had to holler at him to knock it off because he was keeping people awake. This is the Marquette Harbor Lighthouse. A young girl haunts this light, according to the museum folks there. She's about 7 years old. She's dressed in an outfit from the early 1900s, and they've named her Jessie. So I started digging around to see who the keepers were at the lighthouse in the early 1900s, and I found it was the Carlsons. Robert and Anna Maria Carlson and their 3 children, the twin boys, Robert and Carl, who are about a year old, and their daughter, in this photo, Cecilia, she's 3, but she was 7 when they were living at the lighthouse. And I don't know where the name Jessie came from because I couldn't find in any census data that there was a girl named Jessie that ever lived at the lighthouse. But Cecilia hits the right gender, the right time period, and the right age. And so I honestly think that the ghost out there at Marquette Harbor is her. She and her family had served at several lights. They spent a horrific winter on Michigan Island once, where she and her mother and her brothers were left abandoned for 4 days when their father went fishing, and his piece of ice that he was on drifted away, and they didn't know if he was ever going to come back alive. So it was quite a tragedy. Cecilia also had a rough life as a teenager. She got married early, had a daughter. They named her Bertha. She divorced this man, then remarried the man, had another kid with him. But in the census data, she's always living with her kids, with her parents at the lighthouse, and he's living in a boarding house with a bunch of men in town. So it's just a really weird dynamic between this husband and wife. But Cecilia spent the last 18 years of her life at the asylum in Newberry. Not sure what she was institutionalized for, but she died there after 18 years of tuberculosis. At Whitefish Point, this is where Anna Maria and Robert spent their last 30 years as lighthouse keepers. This is where Cecilia and her children lived with them. And it is also haunted by several ghosts. There's a Native American woman here. Of course, there are a lot of shipwrecks in the area, so the lost souls from those ships are believed to be at Whitefish Point. And one of the paranormal groups actually caught a video inside the bedroom of Bertha, of Cecilia's daughter Bertha, in her bedroom in the lighthouse. And it clearly shows a young girl running across the doorway in that bedroom. And you can look it up on YouTube. I think it's Whitefish Point Ghost, and you can clearly see that there. Now, Bertha herself lived to be in her 90s. She helped restore the light. She donated a lot of family artifacts. And she really was dedicated to keeping her family legacy alive at Whitefish Point. They have a bed and breakfast kind of here as well. The Coast Guard building is open. You can stay. You have to bring your own breakfast. But a friend of mine stayed there in 2008, and she said that they had a full house. And over breakfast that morning, somebody in the group finally said, "Okay, I have to tell you all, something really weird happened at exactly 6 o'clock this morning." And someone else goes, "Oh my gosh, something really weird happened in my room at exactly 6 o'clock this morning." One person said, "Well, my door was locked, and at 6 o'clock it came open." Someone else said, "Well, at 6 o'clock the shade in my room went up." Someone else said, "Well, at 6 o'clock someone sat down on the bed and I could see their imprint." My friend Kim goes, "I got y'all beat. At 6 o'clock a child touched my face." And I was so excited when I found out about Bertha, because I called and told her, "Guess who touched you and woke you up that morning?" was Bertha. She was just telling me it was time to get up for the day. Of course, this is where the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in 1975, but this whole stretch, there are hundreds and hundreds of shipwrecks along this coastline. Another one, a noted shipwreck, it was actually on, has anybody ever watched Josh Gates on Discovery? He has Expedition Unknown, Expedition X, he has all those shows. Last night he did one, it was called Expedition X, and they were up at Whitefish, and they were actually investigating the SS Myron here. So I tweeted at him and told him that, hey, you're taking stories from my book. The SS Myron sank in November of 1919. It actually started to sink near Whitefish, and it drifted down toward Point Iroquois Lighthouse, and all the crew were lost. The captain climbed in the pilot house thinking he was going to go down with the ship, and when it reached the water level, it actually broke off, tipped over, and kind of made like a little floating bucket for him, and he actually was the only survivor. Half the men were found in the days and weeks after the accident. The other 8 men were found encased in ice the following April and had to be chipped out and are buried in a mass grave nearby at Mission Hill in Brimley. And folks believe that the spirits of those crewmen that were died in this shipwreck are among those that are at Point Iroquois. But one of the earlier stories I actually heard from this light have to do with the Mission Hill. This is the fire tower nearby. This is actually not the Mission Hill Fire Hill, but it's one near that area. And men used to sit in that tower and watch for forest fires. That was their job. Well, in 1949, the family working and living in this area was the Palmranke family. Mr. Palmranke sat in that fire tower. His wife and his children lived in this house nearby. And in July of that year, their 3-year-old daughter, Carol Ann, was playing in the backyard when a bear came up out of the woods and snagged her and killed her. Well, in the late 90s, I read an article about a medium who was walking along the beach at Point Iroquois, and she had a vision, and her dog with her started to growl, and all the hair on the back of the dog stood up. And the woman went right back to the volunteers at Point Iroquois. She says, tell me about the girl and the bear. And she had a vision about Carol Ann's ghost being at the lake. And they kind of determined that it's likely that the family had visited the lighthouse in the days prior to her death, and that her ghost came back, not to the house where she died, but to a place where she felt safe, and that lighthouse was that place. So her spirit has been noted out at Point Iroquois as well. We are now over to Lake Huron for our final stretch of lighthouses. This is the old Presque Lighthouse. This lighthouse operated in the late 1800s, only was in operation for about 30 years before they deemed that it was too short and it sat too far inland really to be efficient. So they built a taller light a mile up the road, closer to the shore, and this one was decommissioned and then it was sold off as private property. And the owner intended to turn it into a summer cottage, but realized that it was a tourist attraction. So he opened it up as a museum, and in the 1970s, 80s, and into the early 90s, Lorraine and George Paris actually ran the museum and the gift shop. And they took the tours of the tower, and when he died in the early 90s, she stayed on. And it was then that strange things started to happen. And I actually met her at the Lighthouse Conference, which was held for years in Alpena. She was wearing that same outfit. And then I met her again 5 years ago, and she was wearing that same outfit. And I was really jealous that she could wear the same outfit from 15 years ago, because I certainly can't get into anything I wore 15 years ago. She was a spunky lady. I really enjoyed her, but she told me all kinds of ghost stories about George. There were little children that would often go and visit and climb the tower, and they'd come down and they'd be laughing, and she would say, well, what's so funny? And they would say, well, that old man in the tower was telling me knock-knock jokes. And knowing there was no old man there, she would ask them, well, what old man are you talking about? And they would point to a picture of George that was hanging in the lighthouse. Most notably, the light tower here at Old Presque seems to shine even though at the time there was no electricity and no mechanics or anything in the top of the tower. And so people on the water or people at the marina would look out and go, well, why is the lighthouse at Old Presque shining when it's not an active light? And there's nothing there. There was no electricity. So they would go and they would put these heavy wool army blankets on the outside of the glass, thinking maybe there's a reflection somewhere that's making it look like the light is on. But even when that was covered, people would say that they could see the light shining. I presented in this community last September, and I had a group of about 80 people, and I asked them, how many of you have seen the light shining at Old Presque? And all but a couple hands went up. And I said, how many of you have seen it more than once? Probably still half the hands were up. I drove up and down that road 3 or 4 times that night, and I didn't see a darn thing. But we did get to tour the light after dark, which was really kind of cool. So many other stories. Lorraine just had tons of stories about that light. There's a woman I know out of Traverse City, her name is Tammy Schuster, she's a medium. And she did an interview with one of the TV stations out at the light, and she said that she hasn't come in contact with George there, but she has met Don Olds. And Don was friends with the owners of the light in the early 1930s, and he wrote a series of poems about the light, and she says she feels his presence there. Well, I was giving a program down south of South Haven in 2019, and a woman came up after the program and she said, I've met the ghost of Don Olds at the lighthouse as well. She said that her family had a cottage nearby, and in the 80s when she was a teenager, they were messing around inside the lighthouse, and she misstepped, which if you've climbed a light, you know it's pretty easy to do, right? She misstepped and she started to fall backwards. And she felt 2 hands on her back push her toward the steps to save her from falling down the spiral steps. And when she looked over her shoulders, that's the face she saw. So these lighthouse keepers still doing their diligence. This is the Saginaw River Rear Range Light. This is the light that's on the cover of my book. And this lighthouse is now owned by Dow Chemical. It's one of the hardest to see because it's only open for tours when the Tall Ship Celebration is going in Bay City, which is every 3, 4, 5 years. The first keepers here were Peter and Julia Braun. He was hired as the keeper, but he became bedridden fairly quickly after they moved in. And so she stepped up, and for 9 years, she was the acting keeper. He died, and so she gets the formal appointment, and then she gets remarried in what the locals tell me was a scandalous marriage, because her new husband was 13 years younger than she was. And shortly after that, this guy, his name was George Way, he had no experience as a lighthouse keeper, but somehow they demoted her and put him in charge. I don't think she was very happy about that. And then they took her position off the table altogether. They abolished her position. So she could live there as the keeper's wife, but she had no job, no title, no salary. And that really upset her. And then that husband died. Now, I'm not saying she killed him, but she does look sinister, doesn't she? Interestingly enough, in 2018, I was in Bay City doing research, looking for her grave, among other things, and I'm at the library in Bay City, and I run into this guy. And he's got a shirt that says Saginaw River Marine Historical Society, which I know is the group that runs the lighthouse. So I'm thinking he's got to know information. He's got to have details. So we start chit-chatting, and he takes me to the cemetery to show me the graves. And as we're sitting there, I'm asking him, I said, what do you know about the ghosts out there? And he goes, well, you know, the Coast Guard in the 80s said that a lot of the guardsmen would hear voices and footsteps upstairs when they were sleeping, and then they'd go investigate and no one was up there. And I said, wow, that sounds really familiar. So I said, hold on a second. And I went to my car, and I got the draft chapter for this light, and I handed it to him, and I said, hey, read this paragraph. And he reads through it, and he goes, hey, that's my name. I had been given a story about this guy that was in my book, and I just ran into him randomly at the lighthouse, or at the library. And it was great. We've kept in touch. I did a book lecture presentation for their group in Bay City, and then I did a book signing at the Lighthouse during the Tall Ship Celebration in 2019. And that's when I met this young guy. I never did get his name, but they were bringing buses of people out to tour the Lighthouse, and he came out with his grandma and his sister. I think he was 2 or 3. And he comes running in the door. And I'm sitting just to the left. The back, smaller section with the red roof is the summer kitchen. And I was sitting just on the other side of that by that window. He comes running in through the summer kitchen, and he steps 1 foot inside that back door, and he goes, Ghost! Where are you? Where are you, Ghost? And he ran around that lighthouse for half an hour looking for that ghost, freaking everybody out. And he's looking upstairs and downstairs, and he's having conversations with this ghost. He points at Julia's picture. He's having conversations with her. And if one of my paranormal guys said I should have turned my recorder on my phone, just the audio part, because if he was having that much of a conversation, he was hearing something that we weren't. Otherwise, he would have gotten bored or gotten done with it. The fact that he kept that going for a half an hour. His grandma came up and told me that his sister has been seeing ghosts for years. She was 5. So apparently, the family has the gift. My daughter started seeing ghosts when she was 4, so I'm familiar with that. This is the Point Barks Lighthouse. This is in the tip of the thumb in Port Austin. An earlier drawing of what the light looked like. Peter Shook was one of the early keepers here, and in 1849, he was transporting a local doctor from the lighthouse down to Port Huron along the coastline when their boat capsized, and they both drowned and their bodies were never recovered. At that point, Catherine Shook became the first female lighthouse keeper in the state of Michigan in 1849. At least the first that I can find of record. And she served at this light for about 10 years until she passed away. But today, people say that if at the right time, if you go through the lighthouse, which is a totally different light than the one she served at, you will see a woman in an 1800s white flowing dress walking through the light. When I went out there a couple of years ago, there's also now a brick duplex on the property that they built in the 20s for the assistant keepers. And that is also haunted by at least 2 women, and they have in the history 2, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 of the assistant keepers lost wives during childbirth in that building. And those women are still haunting that space. And then I'm going to bring it home with the last lighthouse, which is actually Michigan's oldest lighthouse as well, the Fort Gratiot Light in Port Huron. And this story that you're going to get is not in the book because it happened after I turned the manuscript in. We went down to Port Huron, and there's a paranormal group that does public investigations. And so we paid to go on this investigation, and you spent 6 hours. And it's just like being on one of the TV shows, because they have every gadget there. They have spirit boxes, and they have light sensors and divining rods and now I own a bunch of that stuff too, because I had to have it, you know. So, has anybody ever been to this light? Okay, so I'm showing you a couple aerial shots because I want you to get the perspective of what this park complex looks like. So clearly we have the tower. Directly across from that is the main head keeper building. Just above that, which is to the south, is the assistant keeper building. The small building at the lower part of the photo is the fog signal. And then the white building off kind of 3/4 of the way through the picture with the gray roof, that is the original Fort Gratiot Hospital from the fort that operated down about a couple miles down the road that they moved there to restore. So when you go in and do this paranormal investigation, they divide you in groups and you spend time in each of the buildings. So we started at the keeper's residence, then we went to the fog signal, then we went to the hospital, and then we ended in the tower. And the paranormal group that runs it, they did a great job on their website of documenting past experiences. And so they have stories on their website, and they had audio recordings and transcripts of encounters. And so we knew there were two particular lighthouse keepers who they had regular engagement with. One was Frank Kimball, and he served at this light for more than 30 years. So I thought, okay, on our day going in, I want to meet Frank Kimball. I'm going to ask, when we have the opportunity to call out a spirit, I'm going to ask to see Frank. Or Lighthouse Bob. He worked here until he died in 2010, but he was also one that they've had conversations with at the light. So these are the two guys I'm hoping for. So we get out to the light. Of course, the first thing you do is take a picture of the light. It was a cold, rainy, dreary day, like this morning started. That is my photograph. That is my boyfriend's photograph. He loves it when I bring him into this presentation. Actually, he knows when he gets to this one, if he's in the audience, he leaves the room for the last one, because he can't handle it. So I guarantee you he was not standing on his head. And it's weird, he took 3 pictures of the tower, all 3 of them were upside down, but the ones before and the ones after were normal. No idea. And his phone doesn't have that thing where you can flip it and turn them upside down, like it just doesn't do that. So anyway, that was the first thing. So we go through all of the buildings, we had encounters, and I have video of, they would take little mag lights and put them on binder clips on the floor, and they would ask a question and the light would go off or on. And they had the spirit box that was spitting out words, and they had other things that were moving. We just had weird activity, and we have photos and videos of all of that. But the most interesting part came in the last half hour of our night. And so we're in the tower last, and I'm actually sitting inside that front entryway watching a mag light go off and on and recording that when my boyfriend goes up the tower. So he takes this picture, which everybody takes when you go in a lighthouse. Everybody takes the picture looking down the tower, right? Down the stairs. So he takes that, which isn't particularly interesting. Hello? Battery died. I talked too long. Let's see if it'll turn back on. Maybe there's a ghost in the microphone. Yeah. Hello?
There you go.
See? Stinking ghosts. Okay, so this is the photo. The next one he takes is the one that's interesting. Let me walk through this with you. I'm going to walk over here. Okay, so he comes down the tower, and he's standing at the base of the tower, and he's taking a picture. So here, you can see the side of the tower, right? On both sides. You can see the window, right? Everybody got that? And you can see the black beam in the middle, and then kind of some of the shadow of the spiral stairs, right? Everybody get that? I've got another version that'll show it a little clearer. But what you can also see, the windows from the fog signal building on the other side of the brick.
Lost it again. The sidewalk and the grass, the park lights, right? Explain to me
How you can get inside and outside at the same time. But it's better. I gave this presentation on one of those really big projection screens that brightens it way up, so this really helps. I took a picture of the picture. So now you can still see the side, you can see how clearly you can see the sidewalk and everything. But you can also see his hand, his shoulder, and his phone. How does he get a picture of his own phone when he's taking a picture with the phone? It's like someone took a picture of him taking a picture and put that picture on his phone. Bizarre, isn't it? We've sent this to so many paranormal groups and no one can figure out what's going on. And just to show you, and that's why I showed you the park picture at the beginning.
All right, heck that. If you looked at where that where the wall was, if you blew out the wall of the lighthouse, the fog signal building would be exactly where those lights show up on the other side. That's how crazy it is, right? But it gets crazier. After a week, we go back through and we're trying to figure out how this picture happened. And we're looking at it on the TV, and we're looking at it on the phone, and we're zooming in, and we're looking at stuff, and we finally look at it on the computer, and one of the things that we noticed was that this photo, let's see, let's go back. The timestamp between this photo and this photo is 23 seconds. How many of you can go down 100 spiral steps in 23 seconds? I don't think it's possible. I know it's not possible for him to do it. But maybe a ghost can. But that was the weirdest part of it all, is to go back and look 23 seconds between that photo and that photo, from up there to down here. And nobody can explain it. We've sent it to several paranormal groups, and no one can explain what was happening. Now, if you're interested in more information on lighthouses in the Great Lakes region, these are the absolute two best websites. The Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, which is based in Mackinac City, at glicka.org. They will tell you all the lights, which ones have museums, the bed and breakfast, the keeper programs, and all that. Terry Pepper used to be the president of Glicka until he passed away in February of 19, but they are maintaining his website because he has anywhere from 4 to 14 pages on every light in the Great Lakes, including photos, details on when it was built, how much it cost, and lists of the keepers. So these are the absolute best websites. I use them all the time. If you're interested, I have copies of Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses and the children's version, which came out in May. It's about 3rd grade reader level. None of them are too scary or spooky. I don't think I gave you anything. Well, minus the bodies buried on South Manitou. That was probably the grossest part. But I have friends that read the main book to their upper elementary kids, and it's pretty okay. And then, as I mentioned, the new book coming out, Death and Lighthouses on the Great Lakes, A History of Misfortune and Murder, will be out in March. It includes 12 specific lighthouses and a 13th compilation chapter with another 10 or 12 stories in it. And this one goes through the Great Lakes, which was nice for me to learn about some lighthouses in Canada and Ohio and Door County, Wisconsin, and some of these other areas as well. So that will be out. You can get that on my website coming up in March. And with that, I am going to wrap it up. We can answer any questions, and then I'll be around to sell and sign books.